ahead and begin? Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I am so delighted to be welcoming you to this webinar today on learning through play, promising practices in emergency response. And we will be looking at findings from the PlayMatters emergency response mechanism in conflict-affected regions of Ethiopia. I'm really happy to welcome our team to this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. I'll introduce myself first, and then I'll go ahead and welcome the rest of the panel. So my name is Anne Smiley. I am the Deputy Project Director for the PlayMatters project, which is based in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Tanzania, and I myself am based in Kampala, Uganda. I am joined by colleagues from Ethiopia and from the US who will be supporting the presentation today. I'm also going to present some of our collaborators on the project from Ethiopia and our expert panelists from INEE, who mainly represent the Teachers in Crisis Context Working Group from INEE, as well as the LEGO Foundation. And the LEGO Foundation is the donor for the PlayMatters program. So let me go ahead and get us started. Our presenters today, and I'm going to ask presenters to turn on their camera and wave at us so that you can see who they are, include Tsegaye Lolaso Lenjebo, who is the PlayMatters Emergency Response Mechanism Research and Learning Specialist from Ethiopia. So huge welcome to you, Tsegaye. Also presenting is Jonathan Kwok. Thank you, Tsegaye. Jonathan Kwok, the Regional Research and MEL Manager for PlayMatters at the regional level with IRC based in New York. Some collaborators on the project, if they're on the line, include Tesfaye Berhanu Shefera, who is our Education and Emergency Manager for IRC Ethiopia. I don't know if he's able to wave at us. And Solomon Gadisa Gigi, another emergency response manager for IRC in Ethiopia. So this project could not have happened without the team that I just introduced. We're also going to be hearing from our expert panelists. So I can see Amy Parker there, the Senior Learning Through Play Advisor from Save the Children. So hi, Amy, welcome. We have Paul Frizzoli from the LEGO Foundation, where he is a Senior Program Specialist. I'm not seeing Paul, but I know he's there. Maybe it's just that I don't have my full videos available. Welcome, Paul. We have Danny Falk, an EIE researcher and practitioner and independent consultant. Welcome, Danny. And we have Abla Asaf, Education Technical Officer with Norwegian Refugee Council. So these are our expert panelists who will help guide us through the conversation following the presentation, which is going to really try to situate how the research that we've done in Ethiopia aligns with the Teachers in Crisis Context framework. All right. One thing before we begin in terms of housekeeping, if everyone could put their questions in the Q&A box that is that's down at the bottom of your screen, at least it's at the bottom of my screen. That way we'll be able to keep track of the Q&A as we go through the presentation. Thank you so much. So I am going to launch the conversation. If we can change to the next slide, please, with a quick background. Next slide, please. To tell you a little bit about PlayMatters, the background and the basics. So overall, PlayMatters is a 6-year project that extends from 2020 to 2026. It operates in 3 countries, which is Uganda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. The consortium is led by IRC, who I work for, and most of the members of the team that are presenting today are with IRC. And we partner with Plan International, War Child Holland, IPA, and Behavioral Insights team. The funder is the LEGO Foundation, and we're so lucky to have Paul Frizzoli with us today representing LEGO. And the goal of the project, it's a big, ambitious project, is improved holistic learning and well-being for 800,000 children, ages 3 to 12 plus, in both refugee and host communities in those 3 countries. And you can see the maps on the screen to see where we operate in Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, but it is in the locations where refugees are concentrated across the 3 countries. To the next slide, please. There we go. So what does learning through play mean for PlayMatters? We felt that this was one of the most important pieces of information we could share in terms of the background of the project, because when we got started, we didn't have a clear definition of learning through play. And one of the biggest learnings we've had over the course of the last few years is an ability to do formative research and behavioral mapping that gave us insights that allowed us to really contextually define and begin to deliver learning through play interventions according to what's really needed, to what the policy priorities are for actors in the region, and how LTP can be locally defined. So what we did is we defined LTP as an active teaching and learning method. So it's really about active learning in the classroom. We focused our LTP in the classroom, and it capitalizes on a child's natural desire to engage in play. There are three core elements. The first is that the adult facilitator, generally speaking, the teacher, intentionally plans and delivers contextually and age-appropriate guided playful experiences with clear learning objectives. So having this connection to the curriculum, to the connection to lesson planning, and the connection to learning objectives was really important in helping us link with local policy priorities and link with the interests of the stakeholders we're working with in East Africa. The second part is that LTP experiences promote interactions with people and or materials. So this is really important because what we're looking for is hands-on, minds-on learning. And these interactions with people and or materials, so social interactions and physical interactions, allow children to question, experiment, practice, and discover, developing those critical skills that they need to thrive. The third part of the definition is about safety and inclusion. We want the facilitator or the teacher to deliberately create and maintain a positive, safe, and inclusive environment for children so that they can feel comfortable and they can feel joyful. So this is how we as PlayMatters define LTP. It doesn't mean that is the only definition, but I want it to be clear that this is how we think about learning through play. Next slide, please. Now, when PlayMatters began, we began in a really difficult situation. It was COVID-19. And so we had the first couple years of the project were severely disrupted by the COVID pandemic. But we were also disrupted at a very similar timing by the conflict in northern Ethiopia. It began in November 2020, and it affected millions of children in the same regions we were targeting for PlayMatters, Amhara, Tigray, Afar, Benishangul Gomez, and Oromia regions, among others. And we really were in a difficult situation. It was, again, COVID-19. It was also this conflict, and we didn't have an immediate way to respond to the crisis. We were so lucky that the LEGO Foundation was flexible enough to allow us to put together an emergency response mechanism and have some flexible funding, flexibility in our funding modalities to be able to put together a $15 million response to the conflict. Both teachers and children were affected by the conflict. There was significant internal displacement, and there's still, even now, persistent insecurity between different groups. So because of the flexibility of LEGO Foundation, we developed the emergency response mechanism. It is, or it was originally conceived of as, a one-year multi-sectoral response. So pulling in education and emergencies programming, but also child protection, WASH, health and nutrition programming, basically with schools as the nexus of those interventions. And it was funded under this larger PlayMatters project. So a pretty major emergency response we were able to carry out as a result of LEGO's flexibility. It's implemented by IRC, Plan International, and 10 other implementing partners that are locally on the ground and working, of course, with that LEGO funding. In order to sort of link the bigger ERM, the bigger multisectoral response, with our bigger mandate of learning through play, we adapted our PlayMatters core learning through play teacher professional development materials, basically, in this case, training materials. And we had our PlayMatters staff train partner staff and other education stakeholders, including system actors, in 2 regions where we were operating the emergency response, Amhara and Oromia. And they did a TOT and then cascaded the LTP training as a 3-day or 5-day workshop with teachers. I'm going to now ask for support in showing a video. Hopefully it works. And this video is from the emergency response mechanism demonstrating what LTP looked like. And this was done by our communications team. So all the permissions are there, just so you know, you're not worried about that. This was not from the research, but from our comms team. So you can see what LTP looks like in the context of the ERM. If we can go ahead and roll that, it would be great.
ይሄማ ይዘበራረቃል እሺ የየራሳችሁ መሻማት የለም እንዳይቀደድባችሁ ከዛ ራን ስላችሁ ትራመዳላችሁ ጃምፕ ስላችሁ ራን ጃምፕ sit down stand up sit down jump kick ሁላችሁም የየራሳችሁ ቃስ ብላችሁ ሁሉም የየራሱ እስኪ pen bag pencil book እሺ አሁን ደግሞ እቀይረዋለሁ አንድ አይነት ተመሳሳይ
Thank you so much. I know sometimes technology doesn't work as well as we want it to, but the idea was just to show you a quick audio and visual of what it actually looks like. Thank you. I think we can coming up with the slides again. So let's move to the next next slide and just quickly talk about the methods. One next slide, please. So the study was designed as a qualitative exploratory study focused on the emergency response mechanism. And we just wanted to answer a very simple question. What are promising learning through play teaching methods in crisis-affected settings? Or what are promising practices for LTP in this kind of a setting? So we just wanted to really explore that question. What's working? What's not working? We did the study in 5 locations across the Amhara region of Ethiopia. So we were working with displaced populations that were implementing the ERM, and we had 37 teachers, 28 females and 9 males who were teaching grades ranging from pre-primary level all the way through grade 8, which is the span of PlayMatters support. We work with pre-primary and primary schools and teachers. And most of these teachers had been displaced by the conflict and had returned. Not all of them, but that was kind of the most common profile of teachers, was that they were working in government schools, they had been teachers, and they had been displaced and then returned. As an internal learning study, IRC staff collected data. So this was not, we did get IRB and we went through the necessary ethical protocols, but it was our own staff collecting the data. And that included semi-structured classroom observations followed by semi-structured teacher interviews. And so of course, the fact that our own staff collected the data could be considered positivity bias and be a limitation. So we just wanted to make everyone aware that that is how the data collection was carried out. Next slide, please. In terms of the analysis, we did do 2 different levels of analysis. The first was through open coding of practices observed using the PlayMatters formative research typology, which I'm not showing here, because the focus of this is the other framework that we used for analysis, which is the Teachers in Crisis Context, or TIC, Primary Training Pack Core Competencies for Teachers. And those 5 core competencies are shown on the screen, and we are organizing our findings based on those 5 core competencies. It's important to note that PlayMatters' approach to learning through play really focuses heavily on pedagogy. So that purple piece of the pie at the bottom. We do focus also on teachers' well-being. We have some amount of focus on child protection and curriculum and planning, not so much on subject knowledge. But you'll notice that the majority of our findings focus on that domain of pedagogy, because this is a program that tries to support teachers to build their skills in active learning and student-centered learning, or what we call learning through play. I think I'm going to pass to Tsagaye now to get into the findings, but can we switch to the next slide? Great. Over to Tsagaye now.
Okay, thank you very much. So please next. So to start with the summary finding, while the quality of LTP implementation varies on a spectrum of practices, we generally saw the promising integration of LTP into lesson plans and execution of the LTP activities during lesson and a key component of teacher instructional competencies. So LTP implementation was most prominently observed as supporting quality education delivery and the creation of positive and safe learning environment. These environments are physical environment, which are physical safety and cleanliness, child friendliness, and inclusive environment. And the other is social, psychosocial environment, which includes the encouragement, rapport, facial expression, and the tone of voice. But we observed that there are structural barriers limit teachers' ability to implement LTP, like limited teaching learning materials and large class size for our study. The maximum class size was 18 children, and with the mean of 44 children. Please, next. So when we come to the competencies, the first one is curriculum and planning. So all teachers have lesson plan with almost half of our study participants integrated the LTP well in support of the stated learning objective. However, we noted that there is a gap in lesson plan primarily related with strongly connecting the lesson activities with a stated objective. So the quality lesson plan that integrates the LTP can be challenging. This can be best expressed by one of our study participants who said all subjects are suitable for LTP methodology, but there are some topics or that are a bit challenging to teach through play. However, it doesn't mean that they are impossible to teach. Just it needs to put an extra effort. So teachers prepared and used variety of teaching and learning materials, including locally available materials like posters, visual aids, models, examples, and everyday items, and hands-on manipulatives like stones and dried fluid seeds for counters in mathematics lesson. Please, next. The other competency is subject knowledge. Teachers and students all spoke the same language, despite the PlayMatters LTP training focusing on the general methods. Some teachers described that they would like subject pedagogical knowledge on how to integrate LTP in a certain subject areas. Please, next. The other competency is pedagogy. Under pedagogy, we observed instruction. So educators use varied strategies during class instruction. Pair or group work and independent practice were frequently observed with few instances of being used in the same lesson or in the same time, in the same class delivery time. Additional LTP activities like song, games, storytelling, and role playing were frequently observed to support the lesson objective or learning objective, but some of them are not always relevant. And nearly half of all teachers or all educators use open-ended question, varied according to the appropriate level and the age of the children or the students. Please, next. Please, next. Thank you. And the other is child development and learning style. Teachers demonstrate using age-appropriate teaching methods and understanding child development and learning. This can be best expressed with the writing quote of one of our study participants. Children usually learn best through their tactile experience. It makes the learning more concrete for them. If we only rely on verbal instruction, they might not grasp the main point. That's why we often choose works, especially when teaching the place value of matters. So some of the teachers attempt to connect the lessons to the prior knowledge of the students and used previously mentioned strategy connected with children's life, like banknotes for a lesson, or on identifying the local currency or the Ethiopian birr, brainstorming session on items and the source of location for a lesson on communication in the market. These are some of the examples that educators use to connect their lessons with the peer knowledge of their students. Please next. I think the next is the floor is open for John, please.
Thank you, Tsagai. For assessment practices, we saw that in the competency of using diverse assessment tools, teachers did provide some opportunities for children to demonstrate knowledge acquired through the lesson, either through individual practice or group work or plenary work. But we did note that these activities often did not have enough time allotted or allocated to them in order for the teacher to be able to assess all children. Frequently, it started with checking maybe one problem, but didn't check all five, or started with a few children, but didn't get to the whole class. And so that's where we found some gaps in the planning in terms of the timing of lesson delivery to account for assessment time. And in terms of data-informed instruction, we also found that few teachers deeply understood students' progress and learning levels. One positive example is a teacher organizing students according to 3 levels and differentiating the group work according to the abilities of the different groups. But we found that the lesson was generally not differentiated based on a deep knowledge of each student's progress. And one explanation for this is attribution to the larger class sizes that we saw, which do exceed the government standard in both pre-primary and primary schools. Next slide, please. And in terms of classroom management, we saw some pretty promising practices in terms of positive discipline, with praise and encouragement being frequently observed, even when children were incorrect in providing responses to plenary questions. We also observed good facial expressions and a warm tone of voice from the teachers, and that was primarily judged based on our research staff who are Ethiopian, their assessment of the interactions between students and teachers. We also observed, in terms of non-discriminatory participation, active participation of both boys and girls in both plenary and group discussions. We did know that there were some challenges in classroom management when engaging in LTP with larger classes, especially in keeping all students engaged. And at times, teachers did have to resort to or revert back to rote teaching methods in order to regain control of the class. In terms of an enabling environment, we found that classrooms were generally child-friendly with age-appropriate furniture, and many had posters or other visual aids on the wall that were relevant to the age and the learning levels of the students. The furniture, however, was frequently arranged in rows. In few classes, we did see a U shape with desks that kind of lined in a U around the edge of the room so that the teacher could move around and work with students either individually or when in group work, and we saw that as being promising. Next slide, thank you. In terms of teachers' role in well-being, this was not an explicit focus of the study, but we did find that teachers frequently described applying LTP as a means of enhancing experiences and concept comprehension or memory or active engagement. So highlighting their implicit understanding of their role as a teacher, but they didn't explicitly call out their ethical or legal responsibilities. While they also didn't describe regular communication with stakeholders, they did describe the importance of increasing LTP awareness with parents and community members, so recognizing the interplay between other individuals within a child's socio-ecological environment and themselves. And in terms of professional development, teachers didn't necessarily describe active self-reflection and pursuit of professional development opportunities, but some did express interest in engaging in further training on primarily learning through play, creating teaching and learning materials from locally available materials, and the use of technology. Next slide. Within child protection, well-being, and inclusion, we primarily focus on the environments, both within the classroom and within the school environment at large, in terms of being safe and child-friendly, in terms of being as a post-conflict or sort of conflict-affected space in which many schools were used as camps for military personnel, of making sure that they were clean, that they were rehabilitated to a point that children were safe, whether that be patching up bullet holes or things like that, so that there was both a safe physical and psychological environment that was child-friendly. In the classes that we observed, we recognized that it was a limited sample, but we did not observe any corporal punishment. We can't say that that didn't exist, but it was not observed. And when there was misbehavior, some teachers attempted to use positive discipline techniques, whereas few also transitioned from LTP activities to rote lecture to regain control. We did observe the use of routines, especially with the flow of lesson, particularly in transitions to and from group work, that children seemed comfortable with classroom activities and seemed comfortable with the flow of lessons, which we know is important in terms of reestablishing routines and normalcy for children affected by crisis. We also noted that many teachers appeared to have a good rapport with students, fostering good relationships with them. Teachers also described group work as supporting important social, emotional, and life skills, with this quote that says that grouping children has multiple benefits. First, when they work in teams, they practice the skill of arguing and expressing their opinion, which will be useful for them in the future. Second, they learn to take turns and actively participate in discussions. And next, you can go kind of 2 slides. So some final recommendations. We do believe that LTP can be implemented in emergency response, and our analysis shows a synergy between the classroom instructional practices observed and competencies of teachers in crisis contexts, where LTP interventions can be an opportunity to strengthen teachers' foundational understanding, deepen their work, and complement other TPD programs within EIE. We do find that LTP supported with instructional, lesson delivery, classroom management, and that overall stable, encouraging environment for conflict-affected children. And additional support is needed to strengthen lesson planning practices and assessment techniques for greater inclusion and depth of learning. Providing some of the basic supports to ensure schools are safe and inclusive, like what I mentioned about kind of the broader learning environment as being safe and rehabilitated from conflict. That's important with particular attention to age-appropriate furniture and structures for the effective uptake of LTP, and additional research on the impact of learning through play on children's holistic learning outcomes, or longitudinal research on teachers' long-term uptake of LTP in crisis settings is needed. This study was an introduction or an exploration into what some of those promising practices are, but we recognize that some of the more longer-term impacts or outcomes might need further longitudinal or deeper research. Thank you. I'm sorry for breezing through that. I kind of wanted to provide as much time for discussion as possible. So over to Amy.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation, and I think really interesting, particularly sort of looking at this particular sort of crisis context. So a big thank you to everybody. So I'm here really just to, I guess, moderate sort of a little bit of the discussion. And there's been lots of questions coming through in the Q&A, which is fascinating. So I think what I'll do is I'll just I'll pick a couple initially from there and just ask maybe the different sort of presenters, and I know also we've got a couple of others online, Danny and Paul and Abla. If everybody would like to switch on their video, if bandwidth allows, that would be wonderful. And then, yeah, I guess just it'd be nice just to maybe get some volunteers to jump in with any responses. So I think what would be really nice to start off with is there's a lovely question here around what surprised you, and this is the researchers and the implementers, most about using LTP in these fragile contexts. So is there anything surprising that came through that you observed that maybe you thought wouldn't happen or did happen?
I can start if that's helpful.
Wonderful.
Yeah, because it's been a really interesting process working with PlayMatters, like even from the beginning of reallocating funds to emergency response in Ethiopia, which it was a very helpful process for us, the Lego Foundation, to work with a partner like PlayMatters to do that. And I think one of the things that we were going back and forth with PlayMatters was, well, is learning through play like appropriate in active conflicting crisis settings? Is it something that's needed? Should we even do this, given that the Lego Foundation is really all about play? So I think one of the things it's really and we articulated, okay, well, how it would be related to conflict and crisis settings, what we would potentially do, but what we wouldn't do together in terms of our partnership. And so seeing these findings and the recommendations, I think it like sends a signal to us at the foundation that, oh, wow, learning through play can have a space in acute settings. And I think we weren't sure about that. And so it sounds like it can have so many different benefits, though there are also things to definitely you have to consider, and making sure that there are preconditions set and that there's certain environments that are supported, but that it isn't a yes or no type of response. So I just think this is super helpful to also that PlayMatters and integrated like a learning component into this emergency response to look just at that. So just very, this is very illustrative and helpful. And I think it'll be helpful for other potential responses in the future. So wonderful. That's just my initial reflections.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And it links slightly to another question maybe, but yeah, any sort of thoughts from the Ethiopia team maybe in terms of, was there anything surprising that you sort of observed or felt that you weren't expecting to see?
Maybe Tesfaye or Solomon?
Or I saw Tesfaye come off mute, but he's gone back on mute. Can we hear you? Maybe there's some sound issues. If that's the case, would you, Tesfaye, maybe if you can access the chat, and maybe if you have any points, it'd be great just to sort of pop them in there. so people can read them. Any other thoughts from anybody else in terms of, from the PlayMatters team, maybe in terms of any surprising components that came through?
Sophia, I see you off mute, so I don't want to cut you off. Are you able to chat? Okay. Maybe at, oh, Sophia, are you able to speak?
There's some
Okay.
tech support in the background.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, Sophia. I'll chat with you. But something that was surprising for me, I think, which kind of goes to some of the other questions, but the extent to which some of the interactions between the teachers and the students, just in terms of like the more soft skills, and really seeing the routines and like the care that the teachers were providing to the students in sort of creating that more psychosocial enabling environment, which, given the context and some of our preliminary data analysis of the ERM as a whole, like was showing that a lot of teachers view themselves in a very parental way. It's like we are now like their mothers and their fathers. And so also seeing that come through in the actual teaching practices in the ways that they were operating with the students and like coming alongside them or praising them and things like that, I found exciting and encouraging.
Really nice. And I think that sort of speaks also to the TIC sort of framework in terms of that teacher well-being and then the child well-being. And I know that that's not necessarily the primary focus of PlayMatters, but in this context, it would be really interesting to learn a little bit more maybe around, I guess, not only the child well-being, but also that facilitator or that teacher well-being, given that they're also going to have experienced sort of very difficult experiences, I imagine. And I know certainly from the PlayMatters perspective, lovely to hear that as to whether there was anything that came through in the conversations afterwards, in terms of teachers' own comfort levels or sort of how sort of learning through play methodology might support their own well-being. And maybe over to Danny as well, knowing sort of if there's any sort of other sort of experience that comes through that's relevant here.
I'm happy to jump in and then turn it over to the PlayMatters team for more project-specific reflections. But I think the connection, especially with the TIC competencies around teacher well-being and learner well-being, is really strong and relevant across all phases of crises, from acute crises to active conflict in contexts where I've worked in South Sudan, to more protracted settings where, for example, like PlayMatters is working in refugee settlements and host communities in Uganda and Tanzania as well. And I think something that's important that came up a bit in the presentation around some of the challenges that were observed in this study are just the basic infrastructure challenges that emerge in these settings. Overcrowded classrooms. I think in this study, learners could be up to 80 children in a classroom. In settings where I've worked, it could be up to 300 learners. In this setting, it was more learners from similar profiles with the same language as their teachers. In settings where I've worked, it's multiple languages and mixed age classrooms. Obviously, there have been disruptions to learning due to the conflict, whether that be longer stretches or shorter stretches. And all of that also affects teachers and affects their personal lives, as well as their ability to implement learning through play and active pedagogies in their classrooms. And so I think paying attention to sort of those basic infrastructure challenges is really essential when thinking about introducing learning through play in a crisis context, really across any phase of conflict and displacement, at least from the settings where I've worked, thinking about how teachers themselves may face specific challenges implementing learning through play in their classrooms in ways that then affect their well-being, perhaps because they're feeling lower levels of self-efficacy, which we know is linked to well-being, is really important to consider. And then the ways in which, of course, the conflict affects teachers themselves, when teachers are worried about their own families, perhaps, who have been displaced from the conflict. Maybe they're far from them if teachers are deployed to work in different settings, which is often the case with government teachers, especially in countries in East Africa, when they're experiencing stress because perhaps their salaries have been delayed because of the conflict or crisis. These are all things that will ultimately influence their ability to implement learning through play in the classrooms. On the flip side, when teachers are supported to implement learning through play in the classrooms and other types of active pedagogies and build relationships with their learners, as John was just referring to, this care that they show them, in research that I've done on teacher well-being in Uganda and South Sudan in refugee and other displacement settings, teachers expressed enhanced well-being when they felt they were really able to connect with their learners. And I think learning through play is a really powerful mechanism for doing that. So I will stop talking for now and turn it back over to the PlayMatters team for some reflections.
Thanks, Danny. Who wants to step forward and answer sort of something more project specific? Hello, Segaya, do you have any sort of thoughts on it, maybe?
Okay, thank you very much. So, especially the learning through play in emergency context is very important because, as we know, in emergency context, there are a lot of problems that exacerbate the psychological problem or psychosocial problem for students and the learners, I mean, educators too. So in this time, using such appropriate methodology, especially providing education or delivering education through play is very important, which could improve the learners' psychosocial well-being and the educators too, because as you know, some games by their nature improve an individual's relieve an individual's psychological stress and the like. So this could improve the psychosocial well-being of children and educators too. So what we actually see on the field or response from the educators and children is even if it's the whole part of our study, but we have observed such promising things, improvement on their psychosocial well-being of educators and the children too, including the parental psychosocial well-being too. This is what my reflection on this issue. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, and there's a nice comment that's come through in the chat in terms of sort of kids having the chance to dance, run around and play whilst learning, and sort of how important that is in all contexts, but particularly in crisis contexts. Fabulous. There are so many questions coming through. I'm going to try and pick a couple, and apologies to people who've put them in that we don't get to. But there's a really interesting one here that sort of delves a little bit into, I think this is what you were touching on, Paul, but also in terms of thinking about sort of, I guess, cultural barriers or maybe sort of perceptions around the importance of play and being able to prioritise it. But also one around and thinking about how that links to sort of any differences in using the learning through play approach in classes based on teachers' attitude and assumptions about teaching. So the example here is that in the Iraq context, they see teachers above a certain age who don't feel very comfortable in engaging with play in certain classrooms, and maybe also given your age range is so wide from sort of early up to sort of older sort of primary. Did you observe any differences there in terms of teachers' comfort levels in using sort of more learning through play approaches? And maybe I'll direct that to Annie, who hasn't spoken yet.
Hello, Jonathan.
Ooh, who do we
Yes,
have there?
that's Tesfaye, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Come in, Tesfaye.
I think Tasfa is having problem with his PC, so I will hand over him if my PC.
Yeah, hello everyone.
Hi.
Sorry for, yeah, it is the technology. Actually, this is a problem of quality education, and not only the network problem that we are facing quality issues in education sector, especially in Ethiopia. We are facing such problems because most of our children come from nothing and they join primary education. But learning through play is one of the best things that we can teach children's literacy and numeracy concepts through having their understanding level. So most of the time we have seen in schools that most children learn and love the learning through play because we are adapting their cultural contexts. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is numeracy, and we adapt this numeracy to their cultural context, and we use songs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, such a kind of song. Yeah, so children love such approaches of play-based because they are from emergency affected areas and crisis affected areas. So when we use play and learning through play in classroom, they will be attracted. And even we have checked some random assessment when I was in field support at Warada level and the classroom level. Their retention has increased. The dropout has been minimized totally, for sure, because it was play, it was a kind of song, it was a kind of storytelling. So they lack the approach. Even the teachers, as you said earlier, in contradict with Iraq, in our context, the teachers are happy with teaching through learning play because the Ministry of Education has, of course, a kind of something play approach module, but that was not enough because of shortage of resources. We can't. The ministry doesn't approach all schools. We have a module actually from ministry. O-class module is there, which is mostly play-based, but this our project or PlayMatters project has enhanced, even motivated the directors, even mothers. We have given a one-day training for caregivers. So a single illiterate mother can teach numbers. She can say, I have one eye, I have two eye, I have one ear, I have two ears. So she can play, hope playing within the home. So really we have been interested with the approach, and yeah, even the comment from the school leaders as well as the community was very interesting, except the shortage of materials, as well as the training was mostly for 3 to 5 days. So they need the training because teachers have only 5 days, 3 days training. That was not enough for teachers. They need continuous updating as well as capacity building training. Or else the curriculum, the teaching learning media preparation, each and every teacher prepares, as Jonathan said, if you can see the classroom in our context, it's print rich and attractive. When they move here and there, they can see a kind of posters which are attractive, which makes laugh. So as to me, it was really interesting, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just muting somebody. Really, really interesting and great to hear your voice. Glad we managed to get around the technology issues. And interesting that you did touch on the fact that there did seem to be really good adaptation, adopting, I can't think of the word, by teachers. Was there, yeah, I guess just coming back a little bit, did you notice any differences between sort of specific profiles of teachers or also specific profiles of teachers teaching different ages of children? Because that is something that I face in my work in terms of children, you know, learning through play. That's fine for the younger kids, but once they hit a certain age, then play is not appropriate anymore. And I do wonder if you sort of observed that too.
Hello, yeah. For example, even I have raised this issue, how learning through play can be suitable for grade 7, grade 8 students. But most of the time, we have seen that grade 7 mathematics teacher and the grade 8 physics teachers come to the class with serious approach. He says a kind of frustrating face. So the children are afraid the faces. Because he is mathematician, oh, he is physics, he may abuse me. A kind of such was common in Ethiopia. Currently, when they took the learning through play, he comes with a good facial expression, really. He comes and laughs with the classroom. He calls them, can you multiply? So I have even seen such changes in learning through play. Even they categorize the children with understanding levels, higher achievers, medium achievers, lower achievers. So based on this, they give different assignments based on their achievement. So within the class, if you can observe, it was more of play and fun approach. So most of the time, even the gender parity index, currently, the number of girls has been increased. They do not afraid to play. In our culture, most areas, girls are almost shy and they can't approach a play approach with children. But currently, they are playing with their younger brothers and sisters. So for sure, it was good and interesting as our practice.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I'm aware of time, and I wonder if just as a final question, there's a really interesting one around sort of the specific considerations for applying play-based learning in this sort of more acute context, as opposed to maybe protracted and slightly more stable environments, even though they still are obviously sort of an emergency. So and Paul, again, you sort of touched a little bit on needing to adapt quite quickly and what was appropriate, wasn't appropriate. I guess just from a practical perspective, any tips you could give to people listening in terms of what they might want to consider sort of focusing in on in this type of acute situation? Maybe I'll give the floor to Annie. I came to Annie a while back, but yes, Annie, maybe to you first, and then anybody else who wants to jump in.
Happy to take a stab at it and then can hand over. But just to note once again, as we mentioned at the beginning, that this was a holistic multisectoral response. It wasn't only the teacher training. And I think that's a really important part of why this worked. And so we had, the health interventions, we had protection interventions, we had WASH interventions that were all channeled through the schools. There was a mental health and psychosocial support training that was delivered for teachers as well. We were working, and just to say, it was a mechanism, an emergency response mechanism with 12 different partners implementing slightly different approaches. So it wasn't a completely standardized approach. Again, it was an emergency response. We worked with partners that were already on the ground and already equipped to do those kinds of quick responses. Just another sort of challenge to the situation was that Ethiopia has adopted a new curriculum this year, and nobody had the textbooks or anything, the teacher guides. And so another big piece of the intervention was providing the textbooks, and of course we don't have enough, but nobody has enough because it's that's kind of the resource limitation that we have. But I guess my point is basics need to be in place, and of course I think LTP can be a lovely and useful and helpful complement to other more multisectoral approaches. And I would love to hear John's perspective on that as well, because I know he's in the midst of doing analysis on a bigger study that we're doing with case studies across all of the sectors. John, do you have any quick notes you want to add on that multisectoral response?
Yeah, I typed it up a little bit in response to, I believe, Sophia's question, which didn't fully address, I think, what she was looking for, but a little bit of the ways in which the different sectors did provide a lot of like the basics, especially around reducing like absenteeism and increasing like just access, primarily through school feeding and like MHM kit distribution, and like making sure that children are able to attend. And a lot of our interviews, we're doing case studies, but a lot of children, parents, teachers, and head teachers alike, all of them have talked about how like children are able to come to school like with a refreshed mind, with the joy of school, to then have kind of that foundational aspect to then be able to engage with their teachers. And a lot have talked about kind of that relational aspect between teacher and student. And so I think having some of those core components of WASH, of health and nutrition, of child protection, and like I mentioned earlier, like the classroom and school rehabilitations, whether it be cleanliness and picking up debris from the school campus, or actually rehabilitating classrooms, can help to set the right environment with the right kind of child-friendly and age-appropriate space for LTP to really thrive.
Wonderful. I think that probably speaks to Danny's point in terms of that infrastructure and those and Annie's and everybody's point around having the basics there. It's you can have a really powerful pedagogy, but if people aren't comfortable, safe, not hungry, awake, then yeah, it's only going to ever go so far, right?
Amy, could I add one thing to that?
Yes, go for it, Danny. Yeah.
That I think is also just important when we think both about student well-being and teacher well-being and quality education, utilizing an approach like learning through play in crisis context, is that when there are multi-sectoral approaches that include nutrition and child protection, it also helps not put all of the burden on delivering quality education on the teacher, which we see a lot in these settings. You know, teachers are tasked to be the caregivers for learners in many of these settings, especially if they are separated from their families because of the conflict or temporarily separated, especially in an acute emergency. Many teachers in contexts where I've worked have provided food for learners if feeding programs have been, affected or not set up. And so when there is more of a multi-sectoral approach with partners on the ground, as Annie was saying, who are doing this work already and who understand the context and the needs, not only, I think, does it help the holistic well-being of all the communities that are involved, but importantly, it does take the burden off of the teacher to provide some of these essential services, which they're tasked to do in these settings, which both improves their well-being and I think facilitates an environment for them to be able to introduce learning through play in their classrooms.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to John now. Great points, and then over to you. Thanks, John.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending, seeing the time and recognizing that the hour has flown by. INEE has graciously recorded this and the recording will be available online. And I think INEE and us, we can coordinate to kind of get the unanswered questions and maybe we can answer them via text to address some of that. But thank you all for participating. Thank you to all of the panelists or expert panelists and Amy Parker for chairing and Paul and Danny for contributing to the conversation on behalf of the PlayMatters IRC and the whole PlayMatters team. We're grateful that all of you are here to continue this conversation of, what does learning through play look like in emergency contexts and how can we better support quality education for both teachers and students globally. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.